Okay, so a big welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for giving us some of your time on this busy Thursday. We're going to be looking at the topic of building smarter teams today. So we have got a few slides just to structure as we go along. And as David said, we are recording, so it will be available to you afterwards. Our agenda, we're going to be covering why individual superstars no longer boost performance. We're going to have a look at the science behind cognitive diversity and how that impacts on team dynamics. We're going to have a look at how to encourage psychological safety and constructive conflict. And then we're going to make sure you've got some tips for enhancing teamwork using insights from neuroscience. So, teams, let me just move you folks so that I can see better. There we go. That's easier. So why can we no longer rely on individual superstars to boost performance? Well, the power these days is all in teams. And it's pretty much because all of the challenging work in the world today is really being undertaken in groups or teams simply because problems are so complex that they're too complex for any one single person to tackle on their own. And so we are seeing this propensity for us to work together. And, not that long ago, kind of mid-19th century, there were people, these incredible polymaths, who literally knew everything that could be known, that was known in the world. And it's simply no longer possible for that to happen these days. To give you some sense of scale, the amount of knowledge in the world has doubled in the past 10 years and is now doubling every 18 months, which means that half of what we know today was not even known 10 years ago. And if we talk about the half-life of knowledge as being the time span from when knowledge is gained to when it becomes obsolete, that's continuously shrinking. So, and for me, this was brought home very sharply when during lockdown, actually, I was helping my son with GCSE chemistry. And I did my O-level, as was then, in chemistry back in 1981. And some of the things that I was taught as fact are now no longer fact. They're actually completely wrong. So this whole idea of being able to know everything really has become a nonsense. And what we need is to be able to learn. And what we need is to be able to work with others as teams in order to solve our complex problems. And we're seeing this trend in every field. So a little piece of research by Brian Uzi of Kellogg School of Management simply shows that the vast majority of academic papers are now written by teams, 90% of science and engineering and 75% of medical. Also in business, we see the same trend. So if we look at the number of patents issued, 2 million since 1975 in the US, where this study was done, divided into 36 categories. Almost all of them were actually put together by teams. And equally in financial markets, 25 years ago, most equity funds were managed by an individual, these star players. But now the vast majority are run by teams because they perform better that way. And Brian Uzi concluded from this research that the most significant trend in human creativity is this shift from individuals to teams. And the gap between the performance of teams and individuals is increasing with time. So it's super important that we're really, really good at working as teams. So we're going to have a look at some of the factors that affect that. David.
Yeah, so let's bring up this topic that's now becoming quite popular around cognitive diversity. Particularly a nice book written by Matthew Syed talks about that. He calls it Rebel Ideas. Because there is, as Ali was saying now, more and more evidence that in order to solve complex problems, we need to be able to have lots of different viewpoints. And they've done a lot of research in the last sort of 10 years on these diverse groups and how they perform, but also what it feels like to be part of them. So so if you go to the next slide, Ali, the idea is that there are real benefits from having this cognitive diversity, especially around innovative solutions. And even Syed even talks about how when the pandemic broke in the UK, that the original team put together by the government at the time was missing some key individuals who could understand the complexities of what was going on, because they had individuals who were quite narrow in their focus and thinking that the virus was a particular kind of virus and it didn't recognize some of the issues that needed to be addressed. So the more people we have in the room with greater different backgrounds and different ways of thinking and different disciplines of career and experience, more innovative the solutions we're going to get. And it also reduces the risk of groupthink. That's now becoming quite a common term, where if we want to make sure that we're avoiding this idea that we all think, hey, that's a great idea. So, Mark or Michael or Ali comes up with an idea. And if we're all very much from the same ground, we're all from the same sort of discipline of our careers, we'll all go, yeah, that's a great idea. Because we can all go, yeah, I see where that's coming from. And there's a lack of challenge in the room. And also that means that we get a lot of blind spots. So then the final piece there is cognitive intelligence. And that's really about how to ensure that the sum of the group is always more than the individuals within the group. Because again, they've done lots of studies where actually they'll take very bright individuals and put them together in a group, but actually they can sometimes perform less than people who might be less bright, but who are better at collaboration and managing the interpersonal skills required to be able to be effective in a diverse team. So that whole collective intelligence is more than the sum of the individuals, and goes back to Ali's point around, individual superstars aren't really the way to go anymore. So what are some of the challenges of cognitive diversity? The thing is that there's going to be communication barriers. I think you've often had a situation where you might have said something to some people and you think, okay, I've said my message nice and clear, and yet two people in the room will take away two completely different messages from you. And that's because their brains are wired differently. So in order to be able to be effective in a diverse team, we really need to be able to move carefully around the way that we communicate and avoid, be mindful of the barriers and potential conflicts. Because there are going to be conflicts, there are going to be misunderstandings. And if you go in there going like, I'm just anticipating those, I'm aware that they're going to be there and I'll manage them when they arise, rather than being surprised by them or trying to avoid them. So here's an interesting piece of data. Phillips Lilquist, I knew I was going to stumble on his name a little, and Neil did a pretty important study back in 2009. And what they found was they were measuring people, they were giving them some complex tasks to do. And then they were measuring how the teams performed and how they felt about it. And they had a very homogenous team and some very diverse teams. And they were going like, okay, how well are they performing and how does it feel to be part of the group? And some of the interesting things they found was that the group overall, the performance on the task, the diverse group, as you can see there in blue, consistently outperformed the homogenous groups. But it was interesting that when they interviewed the participants of the groups, the confidence level in their own decision making in the groups was very different. The homogenous groups felt more confident that they were doing the right thing, they were on the right track, and they were making good decisions. Where the diverse team were actually quite doubtful about it and going like, there was so much argument, we're not really sure that we were really confident that when we made a decision, was that the right one? Because there were so many different views. And the perceived effectiveness was similar as well, that the homogenous group felt that they were far more effective. So they had a sort of idea that they were great, where the diverse team felt less effective. And if you think about that, that's really, really important, because if you're part of a diverse team, it's about knowing that you're going to feel less effective. You're going to be less confident in your decisions, but actually trusting that you're going to be more effective overall in the tasks that you complete. So are you letting people in, Ali, on that one?
Yeah, got it.
Yep, thank you. So, that's I found that really quite surprising, how the difference, how it feels versus the difference in performance. And the question then becomes, how do you build stronger teams. And a lot of that has to do with, creating psychological safety. And it's interesting that there's now a bit of a, like, psychological safety is becoming a popular term, but there's a lot of misunderstanding around it, because psychological safety doesn't mean feeling happy and calm and nice and warm and fuzzy. It's actually knowing that it's safe to make a statement, a bold statement, to challenge the leader or another colleague, and have that discomfort in the group, but know that it's safe. No one's going to harm anybody else. No one's going to belittle anybody else. No one's going to demean anybody else or make spiteful remarks or personal remarks. And therefore, actually, it's very important for the manager or leader of the team and the individuals, but the manager, at least at the beginning, to manage the group dynamics, to understand that there are going to be these conflicts, these pockets of disagreement, and not to get, we're going to talk about it later, emotionally hijacked by that and feel that it's not working. It's just to be calm and let it roll through, trusting that you got some good protocols and that you can manage responses effectively, so that if someone is upset, they can declare that, recognize that the intention is actually good, and move on. And we're going to talk a bit about managing responses and building trust, because there's tons of research now that shows that unless there's real trust in the team, genuine feeling of, I know you're not going to do anything that's going to harm me or my career or my position or my promotion, that I trust that you're out for my highest good and the highest good of the organization. And that means that once we have that trust, we can actually cultivate constructive conflict. And Ali's going to talk a little bit about that later. Because unless we have conflict, we're never going to get to the truth. And I think we're still in a culture, maybe more so here in the UK than other places, where it's best to just be polite. It's best to just be diplomatic. It's best just to avoid any unpleasantness. Where in fact, that's not really helpful to getting good results. That's what the studies show. So we all need to be a bit braver and a little bit more comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Okay, so they're the 5 key areas that we're going to be looking at in terms of strategies and tips for enhancing teamwork. So starting then with psychological safety. David's given us a little intro into what it is. I'm sure it's familiar to most of you, I'm sure, but some really interesting work by Amy Edmondson, professor at Harvard Business School, who's really looked at team dynamics and this idea of psychological safety and creating the conditions whereby people can work effectively together. So what are the benefits of us creating this psychological safety? Well, first of all, it reduces fear. It enables people to feel comfortable expressing themselves, sharing their concerns, challenging particularly people who perhaps they consider have a higher status, admitting mistakes without fear of embarrassment or retribution. And this is really about creating those conditions that everyone in the group feels comfortable being vulnerable with the group so that we can get their best contribution. Psychological safety therefore encourages contribution. People are more likely to contribute their unique perspectives and ideas without fear of being belittled or being made to feel that it was in some way stupid or inappropriate. And this is clearly essential for innovation and problem solving. David talked a little bit about groupthink, and psychological safety really helps us to avoid groupthink, which is very common in homogeneous groups where dissenting opinions are often discouraged. And what we really want to access to harness this cognitive diversity is to have all of these different opinions being thrown in and challenging what we're perhaps taking as read in the group. And that helps us to avoid this groupthink and the limitations that can create for us, or the risks that can create. And overall, it facilitates learning. So this idea of asking for feedback, sharing information, experimenting, all of these things are vital in diverse teams. And of course, whenever we're moving outside the known, the comfort zone, and into that learning zone, we run the risk of failure. So we need a growth mindset, and that's really supported by having this psychological safety as a foundation. So how do we go about creating and nurturing psychological safety? Well, there's a lot to it, but just some key tips as some takeaways for today. First of all, Amy Edmondson speaks about setting the stage, and that it's really critical for leaders to clarify to the group the importance of each member's contribution, emphasizing the complexity of the work and how everyone needs to contribute so that we get that diversity of input. So once we sort of set the stage, created the foundational conditions, it's about consistently, on an ongoing basis, inviting participation, being proactive in asking good questions, creating opportunities, and encouraging people to contribute their thoughts and ideas. And then when they do, responding positively. And this about acknowledging the value of each individual's input, even if it's critical, even if it presents a different viewpoint, even if, I'm sure we've all had that feeling of we work very hard on something, someone gives us some feedback, and we know in our heads that we want that feedback in order for it to be the best that it can be. But there's a part of us that really just wants that work to be done and to be valued and recognized. So there's a lot going on in our brains when we get that sort of critical feedback. And in diverse groups, if we're inviting that feedback back, we need to make sure that people aren't feeling uncomfortable or penalized for speaking up and sharing what they believe to be valuable. So, some tips for creating psychological safety. That's our first thing. Our second thing then, handing back to David, is looking at group dynamics.
Yeah, so again, there's been a lot. What I love about what we're learning about now these days is they're doing so much more research about what's actually going on in our brains, because it's only in the last 10 to 20 years that we've been able to discover what's actually happening within a live brain. Because before that, they could only chop up dead brains. And that didn't really tell you much about the processes, the internal processes. So we knew the parts of the brain, but we didn't know much what was going on between them. And there's a research now that's talking about group dynamics and really showing some very interesting stuff. Henry Tafel and John Turner in particular talk about how they coined the phrase in group and out group, and how that really makes a huge difference to our understanding of the people we hang out with, the people we work with, and even the people in our own community. So a lot of stuff around that is really interesting to know, because there's this brain chemical called oxytocin that has a lot to do with this creation of in-group and out-group. It's a bonding chemical. It's produced naturally. First, everyone experiences it with childbirth. Mother and child have huge amounts of oxytocin, and it creates trust. And it's really nice to know that that's actually happens in groups as well. So when we're working well with people, it naturally builds trust. We feel that we're on a common, we've got a common background, or we've got a common purpose, and therefore we're going to trust those people and cooperate with them more likely than someone who we perceive to be out of our in group, so outside of this group. So that this whole idea of silo mentality in large businesses can happen because the finance team, well, we're this team and we're in this group, and then anybody outside of that group is different or bad or some way not as good as we are, because they don't do what we want them to do and things like that. And it also means that actually there's less conflict and bias within the team, but there can be conflict and bias with anybody outside of the team. And, this is really the way I often talk about in-group and out-group is it's so subtle that whatever make of car you drive, I happen to drive an Audi. So if I'm driving along on the motorway and someone wants to sort of cut in because I've cut in on the side of the road there where there might be a blockage ahead, and then they want to butt in front of me, and I go like, you should have been in the queue with everybody else, but you're an Audi driver, I'll let you in. And it's sometimes just as subtle as that we'll actually feel an affinity with someone who has some affinity with us or some commonality with us, even if they're just someone we don't even know. So, but the trouble is that then we'll also have that exacerbated by people from outside our group who could then cause conflict and bias. And again, this whole idea of groupthink and decision making can be seriously affected by an in-group mentality. If we don't have enough diversity within the group, we'll all believe that we're right. And like that study we talked about earlier, we have confidence that we're right, and yet we may be actually completely wrong. There may be serious blind spots. So our decision making can be hampered quite seriously. So how do you go about managing group dynamics? So the first thing is to be, like we've mentioned, there's a real theme that's coming out here, and we're repeating again with lots of layers. It's fostering inclusivity and belonging. If we don't do that, pretty much the research shows that if you're not actively doing it, you're through your own biases neglecting it. And there will be some people who will then feel excluded within the group. You have to put conscious effort into it. And not only as a leader, also as a team member, to say if there's one of the people in the group who's a bit more quiet, maybe need a bit more reflection time, that we give them that space to be able to use their way of thinking, but yet still contribute to the group. And also encouraging cross-group interactions. So there's a great emphasis on a lot of businesses to have teams with specialist function, either functionality from marketing or finance or operations, but also within operations, there's often different groups who have a speciality of looking after a particular client base or a particular discipline. And it's really important to create that sense of cross-group interactions by helping everyone to have the bigger picture of what the organization is trying to achieve, so that we're all part of this business doing this thing rather than just your team. Because it's only when we get the sense of the belonging to a larger organization that everyone is in fact in my in-group. Because I'm less likely to trust people who are out of my in-group. And it even mentions that we're less likely to have empathy with them as well. So that actually has to often come from awareness and training. So some people are more self-aware about this because of their background, having traveled to different countries, speak different languages, understand the dynamics of diversity. But otherwise, we really need to have, and I personally have enjoyed seeing it, being much more aware of the subtleties of what is going on with regards to diversity, inclusion, equity, and all those different terms, to just notice how different groups can feel. And what the experience and lived experience of different groups is, so we can be more sensitive to it. And then valuing the diverse perspectives, as we've pretty much mentioned. Like Ali said, it's not just about saying, oh, that's great to hear your opinion from that, but to actually emphasize it and why you like it and what's good about it, so that you're really giving that person confidence to say more in the future. So let's talk a little bit about managing responses, because we did say that we were going to talk a bit about the neuroscience. And I wanted to mention a few things about what's going on inside our brains. So let's just look a bit. For those, some of you may know this stuff already, but if we take our brain, there's a part of our brain that is only, it's 2% of, no, 2 to 4% of your actual brain, but it's pretty much where you do all of your thinking. And we refer to it as the prefrontal cortex. And cortex because it's like a bark on the outside, and it's the prefrontal piece because it's at the front, just behind your eyebrows and your forehead. And look at what that's responsible for: understanding, memorizing, recalling, decision making, and inhibiting. And all of those things are critical for effective team working. And the thing that most people underestimate is how important inhibiting is. So that I need to inhibit my biases. I need to inhibit my natural defensiveness that's going to show up if you critique one of my ideas. Because it's only by inhibiting that and moderating it that I'll be able to respond more effectively and more powerfully. So the next bit that I just want to mention is the reward system, which is primarily driven by a neurochemical called dopamine. And that inspires us to be energized, curious, wanting to learn more, because there's an anticipation of a reward. And that gives us more access to our prefrontal cortex. So that's worth noting. When we trigger the reward system, which is quite a complex part of the brain around that area, you get dopamine in your system, and that makes you curious, wanting to learn, wanting to find out more about stuff. You've got motivation and energy to do stuff, even difficult stuff, because you've got the anticipation of a reward. And the last bit I wanted to mention is the little fellow called the amygdala. And that's an interesting part of your brain, which is also part of your memory. In fact, it's the memory of every single threat that ever happened to you in your life. And it activates adrenaline, which creates the fight or flight mode. And it's really important to recognize that if you can't label your own feelings and notice what you're feeling, oh, I'm feeling defensive or upset or angry. If you can't label it, the amygdala will keep searching for that feeling until it goes many decades back, often to when you were a child and you didn't have the resources available to you. So you can become quite childlike, which we saw some people do on a debate the other day. One person was finding himself quite triggered and therefore becoming quite childlike in his responses and defensive about it because his amygdala was challenged. So what can happen if we get the amygdala challenged is, go to the next slide, that oh yeah, and just one point that we need to be aware of. So the neuroscience, there's a great guy called David Rock. He runs the Neuro Leadership Institute. We love his work. He actually did a lot of research around this and says that the triggering of the amygdala is 5 times higher than the triggering of the reward system. And that's just a survival thing that we've had for millennia of living on the planet as humans, that the ones that survived had this super sensitive amygdala to be able to go like, that's dangerous. And the ones who had that 5 times more activation of a threat response than a reward response were the ones that survived. So we're the ones that are left with it. So just be aware of that in the work environment. It's very easy for you to be saying something and being unwittingly saying something that maybe someone from a different background or a different culture may be completely triggered by, because that's a totally inappropriate way for to respond to them or to respond to something that they get triggered by that. So we need to be just sensitive to each other and how easily we can trigger each other totally unwittingly. So what happens when that happens? Well, one of the things that we call it is, I think it was Goldman in his book Emotional Intelligence, talks about an amygdala hijack. So we've referred to the amygdala, and it's like it's taken over, it's in charge. So on to the next slide. What that leads to is, it's really interesting. When you get a threat response, the following happens. You get less cognitive resource because you're not accessing your prefrontal cortex. You get reduced working memory. Again, prefrontal cortex is being shut down, and you're just focusing your attention often on a very narrow focus of a particular thing. So you're getting obsessed with details, and those details may have nothing to do with the issue at large. So if you see someone in a team beginning to obsess about a particular thing, you're probably a bit triggered by that, by something else. Becoming defensive, which we've mentioned, feeling that the world is attacking you. And this is also an interesting one. You make accidental connections. So when we first started moving from being mainly in the room training people and moving online, a lot of people would come online and we'd be doing these online trainings and they'd have their videos off, they'd have they'd be muted. And I can remember my brain freaking out because I was thinking like, oh my God, they're not listening. They're not even there. They're doing lots of other things. I'm just talking to nobody because I wasn't getting that natural responses that I was used to in the room. So I really had to manage my own thinking and the accidental connections I would make to that were random thoughts that happened at the same time, and I give them meaning. So I see Alex smiling there, that you can probably recognize that. And then the reward, on the other hand, look what the reward does. So when we get a reward response and we're tapping into the dopamine, we get greater cognitive resources. You can go through these quite quickly. Yeah, more useful insights because we're making useful, positive connections, a wider field of view. So instead of being narrow-minded and narrow-focused on details, we're seeing the bigger picture, joining disparate pieces of information, saying, oh, what's the connection there? Increased ideas for action and fewer perceptual errors. So we just want to emphasize how easily these things can happen and how we need to move into a reward response by all that positive stuff that we've been talking about, acknowledging people, recognizing them, valuing their input. And even if it's an idea that you totally disagree with, at least you've had that idea on the table and say, thanks for the contribution. I might not like it or agree with it, keep that to myself, inhibit those thoughts, but be willing to have people come up with all the stuff that you get everything on the table. Just go past that slide. I don't think we have enough time for it. We'll do that another day.
Okay. Thanks, David. So it was a whistle-stop tour through what's going on in our heads with all of this stuff when we're working with different people in our teams. So one of the key things, again, foundational piece for teams to work effectively together is that we have to trust each other. And trust is another complex thing. And we find one of the most useful ways of looking at how to build trust is the trust equation, which was put forward by David Maister and colleagues. And what it means is that trust as a word actually means all sorts of different things. In some instances, we can look at, oh, didn't mean to do that. C, credibility. It means I trust you to be knowledgeable and to know what you're talking about in this situation. So I value your opinion. R is about reliability. I trust you to be consistent, to do what you say you're going to do, to follow through. I can delegate this to you perhaps in my team and know that you'll be dependable and keep your commitments. I for intimacy. This is all just about getting to know each other. And it's about the ability to create a safe and close psychological environment. So this intimacy really helps with psychological safety. We've all heard this idea of know, like, and trust. If we don't know someone, if they're a stranger and they appear to be very different, I'm less likely to trust that person. So the better I get to know them and get intimate with them in a sort of business-like way, the more that trust is capable of being built. And all of that is great, but it can all be undermined or supported by our self-orientation, the focus on oneself versus the focus on the other person or the group. So if we feel that there's someone in our team or our group who's really only out for their own agenda, that's very much going to undermine trust in the group. So some tips for building trust. So first of all, encourage open sharing. So encourage team members to share their backgrounds, their areas of expertise to build credibility. Set and meet small commitments. So early when the team first comes together, set small achievable goals. Make sure that these commitments, these early commitments, can quickly be met and establish reliability. Create a safe space. So from the outset, back to psychological safety, foster an environment where team members can share their personal experiences or concerns about the project. And this can all be facilitated through team building exercises or just supporting open discussions and conversations. Focus on the team's goals. So remind everyone to prioritize the team's objectives. Decision-making needs to be transparent and in the team's best interest, reducing that sense of self-orientation. And then having regular check-ins, frequent and consistent check-ins to ensure that all the team members feel heard and understood. And that helps in maintaining and enhancing all aspects of the trust equation over time. And if we can build trust, then we get the next important ingredient, which is constructive conflict. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the work of Patrick Lencioni on the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And this just shows that really at the foundation, if we have an absence of trust, we can't achieve anything else as a team. But if we have trust, it enables us to have constructive conflict, which is our next layer. I'm going to move on from there, but just quickly for those of you who are not familiar, if we have conflict, that enables us to bounce things around, commit to the decision, hold each other accountable, and focus on results. But for now, back to conflict. And another really important idea from Patrick Lencioni is this idea of the conflict continuum. Many teams exist in this state of artificial harmony. If they don't have psychological safety, maybe they feel like it's not open to them to challenge and to have this conflict. At the other end, some teams are really just very aggressive and disrespectful to each other. And what Lencioni says is that actually the ideal conflict point is just this side of the line between constructive and destructive. We should be as challenging as we can be without it moving into that destructive zone. So you need to think about whether your own teams are actually feeling sufficiently robust and safe to have that really challenging constructive conflict. And some tips for achieving that, actually drawing from Craig Webber's work on, it's not constructive,
Conversational capacity.
Conversational capacity. Thank you, David. A simple approach for challenging in a constructive way and seeking to find the truth. We start by stating your opinion with frankness and diplomacy, being forthright, but being mindful of how that communication is going to land with the other person. Explain your reasoning, your rationale behind your opinion. And then invite other people to share their opinion with you, particularly if they have a difference of opinion, and be open and reflective. And then review your own position. So we're working together to explore the truth rather than me trying to persuade you that I'm right and you're wrong. So we're more interested in what's right than who's right. So that was a whistle-stop tour through some tips for building smarter teams. David, would you like to just recap?
Yeah, well, it is a nice way to recap, actually. As we come to the end of the session, and we're very open to staying on a bit longer and hearing some questions from you if you're interested. Creating psychological safety is the key to success and to building that smarter team that we're looking for. Because we'll only get to the smartness of everyone if we get everyone's opinion. And in order to get everyone's opinion and create that psychological safety, we really need to manage group dynamics. And as a leader, it's going to be critical more and more going into the future to know we are going to have more diversity in the teams. In fact, we're going to have more generational diversity as teams go forward as well. And then for the leader and manager to be able to manage that, and for each of us to be able to manage our own responses, as we've said, being mindful of how we're thinking, how we're feeling, and how we're managing our own internal dialogue around that, so that we can build trust, because trust and building that oxytocin within the group is key to being able to have empathy and understanding with one another, in creating that mutual understanding that will allow healthy conflict to take place. And we know that I can, for example, be challenging you, but I'm trusting that it's not going to spark off your amygdala, or if it does, you'll be able to manage that and you'll be able to handle that, so we can do it more safely.
Okay, thanks, David. So just to bring things to a conclusion, we'd like to just share with you one of our sort of models of looking at the business world and some of the competing demands that we find ourselves facing in business. And in particular, the conflict between spending time on the strategy, on the plan, versus the performance, the implementation, and also balancing the demands of the people in our business and the business itself. This gives us 4 quadrants. First of all, we have our business strategy. We have to be clear about our purpose, our vision, our strategy, the culture that we need, including things like psychological safety. Particularly relevant when we're talking about teams is we then look at our people strategy, how we're organized into teams, how we select people to make sure that we have really diverse groups and we can access that cognitive diversity, how we develop people, our behaviors, our knowledge, so that we can bring more into those discussions and that problem solving, and how we can engage people with the aspirations and objectives of the team. In the top right, then we get into people performance, and this is where we need to be leading our teams effectively to enable them to have the environment and the context they need and the direction that they need. Looking at the internal dynamics of the teams themselves, and a lot of the stuff we've been talking today about the behaviors within those teams to make them perform effectively. And that has implications for managers managing those teams, and also individuals within those teams, because everybody has a part to play. And then our final quadrant is looking at business performance, how we measure, analyze, evaluate, and change. And we have a range of diagnostic tools that we use, including one I know someone has a vested interest in on the group today, which is our performance climate system, which is a really good way to get some feedback on how effective your team might be at this current time. I've got an eye on the time. We wanted to share lots with you, so we've packed it full and we're going right to the wire. But just in terms of next steps, we will stay on for questions. But if you're interested in the Clarity Matrix, we do have a scorecard if you'd like to discover your score for your organisation. And we will, David, are you able to put the link in the chat, please?
Yeah. Right now.
And we'd be very happy to have a chat with any of you. So do feel free to get in touch and book a free consultation. And if you've enjoyed what we've been talking about today, do please come to the next workshop, which is going to be on Wednesday, the 23rd of October at the same time, 12:30. And the scorecard link is in the chat. So if you have to go, then please do. If you've got time to stay and have a chat and answer some questions or ask some questions, we'd be very happy to take those now.